It's good to see everyone here this evening. If you take your Bibles, please, and you can follow along with us. If those of you are visiting in our study of Revelation, we're coming into the latter part of chapter 20, latter part of our lesson 9, and get into lesson 10. How many of you like a book that's full of imagery and similes, metaphors, kind of figurative language? Do you like that kind of study? Thank you for being honest. But if you're going to ever understand the Bible, you're going to have to love it. You're going to have to get where I want to find out what that really means. When Jesus called Herod a fox, you got a problem with Jesus saying that? No, we don't. But, well, you could just think anything. No, fox kind of puts things, what do you think he means? It's figurative language. And you say, well, there's no parameters. I need to know that. Well, the fox gives us the parameters, and if we treat the language like we do with doctrine and exactly what it says, like in a narrative and what it really means, we're going to recognize this in its context. David, you had your hand up. You knew that answer. What is it? Sneak and crafty like a fox. Then we move on. That was imagery. That's figurative language. I've always been interested that when God tells people what to do to be saved, he doesn't use figurative language, but he sure does describe the Christian in figurative language. Sheep. And all sorts of imagery we see with what is the kingdom like? It's a vineyard. It's a body. We have to think in those terms all the time. But I think what happens as we look at the book of Revelation, it's all starts from the very beginning of things that signifies, and there's imagery that we're not comfortable with, like a fox. And then we begin to struggle with that. And I think it's good to struggle, and sometimes we cannot be exactly say, well, that's exactly what it says, and so that happens a lot in the book of Revelation. But one of the things we have been consistent in is seeing the movement of this book. And while the book is taking us through the things that must shortly come to pass for the reason why the book was written, because of persecution of saints, not now, but saints that lived then, he does take us in these last 3 chapters. He takes us to the judgment, which is, I think, in the imagery there will be, well, why is that, why do you call it final judgment? Because the things surrounded it said leaves you no other room to move if you're going to understand what he says. And so we come to this. What is the book of life? Is that figurative language? I'm not going to move till you tell me. Is that figurative language, the book of life? Is that a literal book? Is the book living? Is it a book that produces life? Well, sometimes the gospel message is the book of life. But is that what he means here in this context? Because what we see here is that, as we saw, the books were open. And then there is a book. That distinction also, all right, I need to find out what, if there's a distinction between the two, and the writer said apparently so because he used plural instead of just one. He used one instead of plural. So I've got to nail that down in my mind. And why would it be plural? It's because there's a lot of people have done a lot of things. And mankind are being judged of what they did. And I know from my other Bible, we're going to give answer whatever we've done. We will give answer for our thoughts. That God remembers our thoughts and will bring that. He'll make manifest the secret things of our hearts. Now that's just a fact. There's no figurative language there, because I think in my heart, and it's secret, nobody else knows. God's going to manifest that. So books, the idea that there are many books because there's many lives. And we're going to be judged out of those books. That's consistent with what the Bible actually says will occur. And so I ought to be able to fold those things together and appreciate that, and not say, well, I don't like figurative language. But here we get to this book of life, singular, and we began to think, well, what would that mean? Let's take a journey. And when we come to the book of life, we'll say, does Revelation, is that a scriptural concept, the Lamb's book of life? Are we reading that when we read the book of Revelation? Do we read the Lamb's book of life? Do we see that phrase here in the text anywhere in the book of Revelation? Yeah. And so you say, well, where did I see that? And how is it used? Well, let me just take you to the Old Testament first. That's one of the things we've been trying to set forth. We've studied the book of Ezekiel, we've studied the book of Daniel, and for preparing us for this type of literature that we can say, all right, that's the imagery that I'm looking at there, and that's what we see in the book of Revelation. But this book, singular, has been in the Old Testament, and it just didn't come along in the New Testament. Now, the Lamb's book of life, the Holy Spirit takes that lamb, because now we see it's in a context of, and who is the lamb in Jesus Christ? Is that Jesus Christ? He's a literal lamb? Or is that figurative language? We understand it's figurative. We understand that. The slaughter of a lamb, he's been slain, he's now standing. A lamb standing that's been slain? Possible, no. It's figurative language, said the lamb was dead and now he's raised. And so I began to grasp that. I said, well, that's what it means. I'm serving a resurrected lamb who was dead and is alive. But I want to establish how God speaks about a singular book, and you won't be wandering around all over the place. I just don't know what all that means. I think you'll appreciate, I hope you'll appreciate it, what it means. So, all right, Exodus 32:32. What's happened in Exodus 32? What's the context of Exodus 32? What is he coming down from the mountain, and what does he see? David? Now, golden calf. Is that good or bad? Very bad. And so God's displeased. And Moses is displeased. But Moses stands, and we say, in the gap. And he appeals to God on behalf of the people of God. Do not destroy them. And first, before you do that, God, blot my name out of the book that you have written. Book, singular. Blot my name out of the book. Who wrote it? What does Exodus 32:32 say? I can't wander around thinking about what I want to think about. Let's pick up like a book. It is a book, and I know from that passage, it's written by God. He does the writing. He does the writing. And God says, no, those who sinned are the ones that are taken out of that book. And Moses, you hadn't sinned. The people had. All right? We go from there. Psalm 69, it's also in the Psalms. I've got the law, I've got the Psalms. And what we see in Psalm 69 in verse 28 is in a context where he is talking about the unrighteous. He says, may iniquity be added to their iniquity. And may their name, may it not be written along with those who are what? Righteous. Who do you think's names are written in that book? That's solely for them. The righteous. Iniquity, people practicing it, you don't belong in this book. Singular, book. But things are written. And this is a book of life. It's called a book of life. What is the Lamb's book of what? Life. Are we talking about two different books? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. We'll just have to let the Bible tell you. But this is the book of life. Whose names are contained there? The righteous. It's only reserved for them. It's only reserved for them. Malachi 3:16, we come to the end of the Old Testament. And we see that Malachi speaks a book of remembrance. Now, how would I harmonize that with the book of life, the book of the righteous, How would I say, oh, this book of remembrance? How, if I wanted to say, could that be the same book? And I said, well, how would it be book of remembrance and a book of life? Well, that must be a contradiction. And we just don't know the answer to that. No. Why is it a book of remembrance and it could also be a book of life? It could also be a book that God writes. And also could be a book that God writes in heaven. How could all those harmonize? Very easily. God remembers those who are righteous and that belong to Him. And what's happened? Their name is written where? In the book. Their name is written in the book. Wow. I got the law, I got the Psalms, I got the prophets. As far as the law of God was concerned, I've covered all three, and every one of them have the book of life, book of remembrance. So it's not something that God has hid and threw on you in Revelation. You say, I don't know why does He do that? Because it's always an indication that God is remembering those who are righteous and those who are holy. And it's uniquely connected with them. That's why they're not a bunch of books. It's one book for God's holy people. And He remembers them. And you don't blot, He will not blot their name out that haven't sinned. That's why Moses' name wasn't blotted out. But we continue. We come to the New Testament. When the miracles are being done and the disciples realize, well, we have seen Satan fall down from heaven. And it's in the, whoa, he fell down from heaven. That's a figurative language. I need to understand that. It's because he's being conquered by one who's stronger than he is, and we're doing miracles and casting out demons. Devil is falling in his power. That's figurative language, but you don't understand the text unless you grasp it. So I don't want to understand that. And then when you do, it's something that stays with you and it enriches your knowledge. And when Jesus talks about the fact a stronger man than the demons, who was able to cast out demons, a stronger man than he does comes in and grabs hold of him. And then he said, when that happens, you know the kingdom of God is upon you. Something stronger than the kingdom of the devil is in place. And that's God's kingdom. But we go off the line. That's the context of Luke 10. He said, don't rejoice that in these miracles, but what should you rejoice in? That your names are written where? I wonder if the book's involved with that. Yeah, it's consistent. He remembers them. Their names are written in the book of life. It's written where? It's in heaven. God writes them. Where does He write it from? He writes it from heaven. And rejoice in that. My name is written in heaven. Does God need? Oh, I wonder if I spell their name correctly. Oh, I just forgot. I've got to write myself notes or I'll forget who they are. Does God have to work that way? No. And He doesn't have a literal book. He doesn't need one. And He doesn't need a cell phone. God knows. He's just saying, for my benefit, I will remember you. And I want to rejoice that something greater than miracles is there because my name is written where? And He remembers. And that's something you ought to be happy with. Now, we come to the epistles. And this is, you want to be a fellow worker in the kingdom? You can rejoice too. Because it's not just the apostles. It's not some super saint that gets their name written in heaven in the book of heroes. It could be two women that He wants them to have harmony again. Apparently there's a problem between the two, and he's appealing to his true yoke fellow to bring about unity there. Help these women, for they labor with me in the gospel, with Clement also and the rest of my fellow workers. Clement, Euodia, Syntyche, common names of people we don't think about a lot in the Bible until we read the epistles. And he said, and the rest of my fellow workers, I may not know them, but what we know about them. Whose names are in what kind of book? Book of life. Singular. There hadn't been a lot of books. There's been one book. It's been around a long time, creating imagery of these are God's people. And they have certain characteristics, and no one can be in that book unless they have those characteristics, and they are remembered. People that we don't think about, that we don't know from history, their names are not blotted out of that book. So we come to the book of Revelation. And this is not the first time in the book of Revelation that we've seen this book of life, that we've seen the Lamb's book of life. And so I want us to see what we find there. Revelation 3 and verse 5, it is what's going to happen one day as people face the judgment, and every one of these churches, individuals will be judged, and this is encouraging. He said in verse 4, thou hast a few names in Sardis. So when he said thou hast a few names in Sardis, what does that mean? You're going to have to do some connection. That's figurative speech. Is Smith better than Jones? What does your name mean? What do you mean, your name? My name's Fite, that's all I care about. Whose name? You have a few names. Wonder if you saw some horrible things that I did and it's connected with my name. Thou hast a few names there. What does he mean? Thou hast a few people that are identified with something. Oh, I know what they are. That did not defile their garments. See, your name sums up your character. And if you're going to understand your Bible, you're going to have to understand why a good name is better than precious oil. What is he saying there? Your character. It's not, hey, my name is better than yours. Because, you know, it has a lot of history to it, and yours doesn't. It's your character. It sums up who you are. And so when your name is written there, it has to do with your character. That's why he says he's righteous. That's why, but all of that harmonizes. And we begin to realize, well, that's what we see. So he says their names, you have a few names in Sardis that did not defile their garments, and they walk with me in white, and we say, well, that symbolized something in the New Testament. Colors and numbers do in Revelation. So what does white symbolize? And I don't think we've had any trouble with this, because why does our bride get dressed in white when she gets married? Purity and that sort of thing. And so it's in white. And he says, for they are worthy. They are worthy because they've lived holy lives. He that overcometh shall thus be arrayed in white garments, and in no wise, and I will in no wise, Jesus has said, I will in no wise blot his name out of the book of life. I will not blot out who he is. We'll just sum it up with his name. And that name is said, well, we can get a hold of that. Your name's there, your name's not there. But it has to do with your character. Out of the book of life, and I will confess his name, confess who he is. I'll confess, know who he is. What did that name represent before my Father and before his angels? And so again, does that sound like what happened up here in Does that sound like what happened up here in Exodus 32? I will not blot out his name. Moses, I'm not going to blot out your name. Only those who what? Only those who sin. And that's why I no wise blot out their name, because they're worthy. They are holy. They haven't defiled their garments. They're justified in my sight. And so we begin to realize that, well, that all harmonizes. And it's all dealing with a single book. What about Revelation 13:8? And it's interesting, if you have the King James translation, and I was trying to think of the other translations, this may read a little different to you. He said, chapter 13 and verse 8, and they all that dwell on the earth shall worship him, everyone whose name hath not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that hath been slain. How many of you have the Lamb that hath been slain from the foundation of the world? Yeah. And so what does it belong to? Is it the Lamb that hath been slain from the foundation of the world? Or does it have to do with the name which had been written from the foundation of the world? Both of them are true. And our study's not going to deal with that. But that because, well, I need to figure out which translation I'm going to have. Yeah, you do. But when it all boils down to it, you take Jesus out of that, and I can show you that is consistent with Scripture. God's eternal plan that Jesus is going to be saying, and about the type of people that will be in heaven. That's before the foundation of the world. That's the eternal plan of God. So either one of those would be true. But Calvinists love that. Can't you see why Calvinists would love that passage? Your names have been written when? From the foundation of the world. There's no way you can miss it. If your name's there, it's always been there, and nothing you do about it. That's Calvinism, but that's not what other part of Scripture leads us to. But what it says is that it's God's eternal plan, and these were the people, because they worship the beast, they're not characterizing the people of God who's been written in the name. The name's been written in the Lamb's book of life and from the foundation of the world. They never have been included in a list of people who worship idols. But we see that. Same negative thing is found in Revelation 17 and verse 8. Here he says it's not these type of people. What are these people doing in verse 8? He says, and they shall dwell on earth and shall wonder, they shall wonder whose names hath not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast and how that he was and is not and shall come. They have nothing to do with the beast. So they sit there and wonder at him because their names have been written in the book of life from the foundation of the earth. So God's people will look upon that with wonderment. They're not connected with him at all. There's no mark of the beast upon them. They're being connected with the written in the Lamb's book of life, that eternal plan of God. And they have brought, because they have become Christians, they are brought in that their names are written there. And at the judgment they are worthy. So we've been seeing that. And then we see in Revelation 21, and that'll be verse 27, we come and see it, and we'll see it in a few moments, well, as our study continues. But chapter 21 and verse 7, and there shall in no wise enter into anything unclean, or he that maketh an abomination and a lie. See, they had no part with the beast that's lying in idolatry. But they that are written in the what? Lamb's book of life. So a book was opened. And you'll notice that in chapter 20, and we'll see, and the books were open, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. Could that be the Lamb's book of life? I would probably think so, until you tell me why it can't be. Lamb's book of life, book of remembrance, just names written in heaven. We understand all of that has to do with God's redeemed people. And the dead were judged out of these things which were written in the book or books. Which is it? You can't guess at that. And you can't say, well, I think it ought to be this way. No, what does it say? Books, plural or singular? I says plural. You were judged out of what books? Maybe 2 Corinthians 5:10 will be what you would like better. That we'll all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give answer what we've done in the body, whether it be good or bad. That's right. How will God remember that? Well, follow the imagery. He writes it in many books that is going to be brought to the white throne of judgment. And you'll be judged. out of his books. That if he had to, he would record it. And it will all be made manifest before us. A lot of figurative language. And I hope you just grasp it. I love that. I want to understand what that means. And I realize here when the writer makes a distinction between book and books, don't go over that and say it doesn't make a difference, whatever you think about it. No, there's only one way to understand that one right. And when you realize that, you realize, books, it's always consistent. That's what we'll be judged out of. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave the dead that were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. That's like 2 Corinthians 5 and 9 and 10. I was right on target with my thinking about books, wasn't I? And you are too. Reading all this done that together. Death and Hades were cast in the lake of fire. This is the second death, even the lake of fire. And if any was not found written in where? In the book of life, he was what? He was cast into the lake of fire. I don't know about you, but just this review makes my knowledge of that verse enriched. It means a lot more to me when I say, I want to know what that means. And realize that here is the book of remembrance of God that has for his people, and it's reserved for them. Don't let anyone place a name be named with the righteous, and God said it will never happen. In fact, your name will be blotted out if you want to live unrighteous lives. It's consistent all through the Bible. The law, the Psalms, the prophets, the epistles of Paul, and a bunch of times in the book of Revelation. But it never contradicts itself. The concept is there for us to grasp. And I want us to appreciate the language that God chooses to use, and there's parameters to understand it correctly. Now, has this been Bible study? So let's think outside the box tonight. What's your thought about that? Maybe I haven't given you time to think, but will it be consistent with the whole, taking all that God has written about his subject and then sit there and make what harmonizes with it all, and what will harmonize them with every time you see the passage? You'll understand why is it called a book of remembrance? Because you're not going to forget who's in that book. Can your name be blotted out? Yeah. That's why he says to the church of Sardis, I will in no wise blot your name out, because you can. But whose names get blotted out? Those who practice iniquity. He'll blot that name out. That's something I can learn from that. And I'll tell you, it's so unique and it's always there, that they're never going to be connected with unrighteous people at the day of the judgment. And from here, because we come to chapter 21, 27, and there shall no wise enter into it anything unclean that maketh an abomination, but only those names that are written. But only they who are written in the Lamb's book. It doesn't say the names, but we know their character, identifies them by name. That's why it's consistent with everything else about names, that they've been written in the Lamb's book of life. That's the only people that can enter where? Into the city. And again, that's going to be figurative language for us. What do you think the city is? As far as the way we can have a concrete idea. It's heaven. Heaven in its glorified state. Now, there will see some that disagree with where we're going to go into the next chapter, and they'll say, no, that's not heaven, that's the church. And we need to be able to deal with that. Could it be just he's describing the church? And but I want us to see, do we understand the Lamb's book of life? And is it hard to understand? I don't think it is. Now, do you have something that's, well, I've got, that clouds my thinking a little bit? Or is that clear? But that's figurative language as if God needed a book to remind ourselves of something, of himself or something. He doesn't need that. That's for our benefit, that we will not be forgotten. Because that's how we operate. Why does God tell us that our inheritance is undefiled and fades not away? It's undefiled, it's no blemish. It doesn't fade away. How come he tells us what it's not? Because we know what blemish means. It means dirty. We know what fades away means. It loses its luster. God just says it just doesn't do that. I get a hold of that. Because I don't think I can grasp how glorious it is. He told us what it's not. And so take the language that God has written in the text and grasp hold of it. Because if it's figurative language or these are things done by sign, when Jesus did miracles, was he interested that you think about the miracle, or he wanted you to think about the sign? What do you think? That's not our lesson. So it's just what you're thinking. When you say many other signs that Jesus do in the presence of his disciples were not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe and have life in his name. I better understand, what are the signs? He said, many other signs. What is equivalent to the signs? You know this. Don't. I don't think your voice will be recorded. I can't hear you. I can. What are the signs equal to? I'm not going to tell you. What is it? Someone. Thank you. Simple miracles. Well, miracles, that transcends natural law. That's something that causes wonderment in men. That's the whole idea. But don't get involved with the wonderment, because Jesus wants you to see what it signified. It was a sign. And what was it a sign of? Well, it's a sign of his deity. Well, that's... Then Paul, when he did miracles, was it a sign of his deity? No, I better back up a little bit. It was a sign that confirmed the message of the messenger. Now, if the messenger is Jesus, it confirmed that he's from God in a special way. He's the Son of God. If it's Apostle Paul, it confirmed him as a messenger, what he's preaching, as being from God, without him being deity or the Son of God. Now I can apply it everywhere that the Bible applies it and have a concept of that. But I had to deal with, what does sign mean? We see signs on the highway. We see that curvature, that black on yellow, so we can see it. And we got to go 20 miles an hour because you've got about all this, maybe 15. What is that a sign of? Well, it's made of certain metal, and it's yellow paint with black paint upon it, and it sometimes it's kind of a different shape. That's what's a sign of. No, what's a sign of? It signifies what lies ahead of you, and you better pay attention to the what? The sign. The sign is not what you glory in. You glory in the fact, I've been going 75 miles an hour, and all of a sudden I'm going through this little town. There's that little street. I better get ready for it. Thank you for the sign. It always signifies something beyond itself. Always. If we grasp the meaning of a sign. And so God comes along and said many other signs. He expects us to understand that. But if we don't want to understand, and I'm not saying you do, it's just the fact it becomes difficult, because I think sometimes we have to, well, there's no parameters to it. Yes, there is parameters. And that's why people love to go to Revelation, because they can make up anything they want, but context won't allow it. And so I'm coming, in this reading, we've seen, so people already are entities already cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. Well, that's not the end of time judgment, because I know something happens after this. But here, what have we just seen in verse 10 before we come to this judgment scene? Who is cast into the lake of fire and brimstone? As we enter into the judgment scene, who is defeated? The devil. I mean, when God comes, when Jesus comes in judgment, and the books are open, the devil is already in heaven. Yeah, in hell. Yeah, he's ready to greet you. He's ready to greet you if you go there. So let's follow this. We got the books and we got the Lamb's Book of Life. Let's see, what is the second death? Thank you. And we read about, well, verse 14, tell me what the text says the second death is. Okay, that's true. Verse 15, but verse 14 says the lake of fire, and who's there? See, let me get to this last one. Who and what are cast in the lake of fire in this section? I know the devil is cast into that lake of fire in verse 10. Now, what is cast in the lake of fire? Why are they two things? Why does he say it's death and Hades? And it says in verse 13, the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and they were judged, every man according to their works. And so you got death and Hades connected, and you got the sea giving up the dead that were in it. And all of a sudden in chapter 21, we'll find that the sea is no more. Well, because it gave up the dead that were in it. So why would death and Hades be connected together? What is death? Separation. What's separated? My spirit or soul, inward man, soul, spirit, that gives life to the body, is separated from the body. And where does the spirit go when I die? Hades. And so death is conquered. Well, there'll be people living when the Lord comes in judgment in the last day. I mean, Thessalonians say we're going to be changed a moment, twinkling of an eye. Those who are living will be caught up in the air. The sea is no more. And you read about the sea in Revelation 4, the transcendency of God. And we've seen the beast coming out of the sea. So we've seen that which has separated us from God as we live here upon this earth, and the sea of humanity. So the death came out, the sea gave up the death. I don't think that's called the Atlantic Ocean giving up everybody drowned. It could include that, but see, there's death and Hades in this chapter, in this text. What would be the sea? I think it'd be the sea of humanity. And when there's people that are going to still be living, they're going to be judged as well. And they'll have to, they'll have to go through this as well. And so those who die, in essence, they're going to be separated and so forth for judgment and united together with judgment. There'll be change. There's that change that takes place. And that's difficult to what the sea is, because the sea could be the literal sea. And people that wonder what happened to those who have died. Well, the death will give up those in the death of the sea. That is very well a possibility. But it seems like death and Hades are distinguished from that, and maybe those who have died and gone, and that they're going to be delivering up the dead that are in it, and all of humanity, the dead in it, will be now brought to judgment. And we're going to see the idea of the book of life. Now, we go into chapter 21. Why in the world? I've just got the judgment. I've got what is the second death? It's the second separation. So what would be the first death? I think the literal physical death. The second one would be the spiritual separation from God forevermore. Is the second death a big deal? Yeah. And you know what? We'll all experience the first death, but we don't have to experience the second death. So why does he now go to chapter 21? And this is where, I know our time is short, but we'll get into this. Why is the church described in connection with such terms as the new heaven and new earth? And why would I use the word church here? I'm doing that to accommodate those who believe that this is what, it's not talking about heaven. It's talking about the church. And it's usually in the context that destruction of Jerusalem happened in AD 70. That's what was the judgment that we've been reading about. It's been talked about. I don't agree with that concept. But let me just read that and set the stage, and then our time is up. I saw a new heaven, new earth, for the first heaven, the first earth have passed away, and the sea is no more. And I saw a holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. Could you make a good case that that's the church? Is the church the bride of Christ? Is it New Jerusalem? Spiritual Jerusalem? I take it to Hebrews that. Is it a holy city? That's right. Coming down out of heaven. Where's our kingdom? Our kingdom is in heaven. It's a bride adorned for her husband. So it's the church, but it could be the church in its glorified state. Are we speaking now the glorified state of those who comprise the church? I believe that's true. But it's interesting to me that in these first few verses, before we get to verse 9, it seems like he recapitulates everything that we've gone to so far. We got who's going to be judged. He that overcometh shall not, and there's the judgment. There again is this church that's victorious. And there's God not mourning anymore. Well, I thought we had the judgment and that was over with. He brings us up to date and then lets us see the glory of this church. And he does it with what? How does he tell you how glorious heaven will be? Figurative language. Get ready and just grasp it and enjoy it and let it lead you into what the point that he was making. And we'll be ready to discuss that next time. Thank you.